Hello, my name is Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline Times podcast. The Byline Times, it's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, after Partygate, before Sue Gray. Reflections on the curious case of a Prime Minister found to have broken the laws that he made over COVID and who it emerges now was also present at a leaving do that at least one other person was fined for attending, but for which there was no punishment of Boris Johnson himself. Questions abound about the health of our democracy when a proven liar can cling to power, where the police appear to be acting with a considerable degree of inconsistency, to say the least, and where the senior civil servant charged with getting to the bottom of the whole affair can be summoned for a meeting with her boss, the PM, the man whose behaviour she's investigating. Let's hear now from Hardeep Matharu, the editor of Byline Times, and first Adam Bienkov, political editor and chief Westminster correspondent of the Byline Times.
Good morning, Adrian. Yes, it's been another bizarre week already, and we're only on Tuesday. I think people are still sort of reeling from the decision of the Metropolitan Police not to investigate Boris Johnson for attendance at some of these parties, not to fine him, particularly given the release of those photos yesterday showing him clearly at a party for which we understand he was not even sent a questionnaire to ask him about. It's very hard to understand why that might be. And indeed, trying to understand the decision-making process of the Metropolitan Police generally is like trying to practice an advanced form of criminology. You know, it's such a ludicrously opaque organisation, and it's made a series of what, from the outside, appear to be completely contradictory and sort of unfathomable decisions throughout this scandal. You know, initially in December, they refused to investigate at all, despite all of the evidence that everybody had seen of law breaking in Downing Street. And then there was the questionable timing of when they eventually launched the investigation, just before the Sue Gray report was due to be published, and therefore delayed the Sue Gray's report. And then their decision to fine Johnson for what appears to have been the least controversial of all of the events that were under investigation, the sort of birthday cake event, but not to fine him for what we now can see with our own eyes were very obvious parties with lots of alcohol, while at the same time fining more junior members of staff for attending those same events that Johnson somehow avoided. So it's very hard to understand why that was, but I think we can sort of assume a couple of things are going on here. The first is that Johnson and sort of other senior members of the government, senior members of civil service, would have had access to very good lawyers who have been able to advise them on the sort of best responses to avoid a fine, or whether to indeed to respond at all to the questionnaires that they were sent, whereas younger members of staff wouldn't have had access to that, and also would have already confessed a lot of what happened to Sue Gray when she was writing her report, without knowing at that point that information would then be passed on to the police. And so that could explain part of it. However, the problem with this explanation is that we know that Johnson wasn't even sent a questionnaire for some of these events that we now see that he attended, whereas others who did attend were sent questionnaires and were fined. And it's hard to kind of square that with the evidence. So I think that that does sort of lead us to another conclusion, which is that the Metropolitan Police must have been put under some sort of pressure not to give Johnson a fine, or indeed not to even investigate him for some of these events. And obviously, that's part that would be legalistic pressure. We know that he had access to good lawyers who would have pressured them not to do so. But also, it's hard to not suspect that there may have been some political pressure here as well. Even throughout the course of this investigation, there were stories in various papers quoting allies of the Prime Minister warning the police to back off of their investigation. And that's what we saw publicly. What we don't know is what was said privately. And there's been other examples here. The Times reports today that Johnson personally tried to pressure Sue Gray into abandoning her inquiry. Well, was similar pressure exerted on the Metropolitan Police, and was that pressure successful? And I think if evidence does emerge that the Prime Minister sort of personally leaned on senior figures at the Metropolitan Police, I think that could be an even bigger scandal than Johnson's involvement in the parties themselves.
Yeah, and Hardeep, of course, Sue Gray is the senior civil servant charged with investigating the entire Partygate affair. For many days, allies, ministers, allies of Boris Johnson, ministers were indignant at the suggestion that he had summoned her. But now it appears that, in fact, Boris Johnson was the person who initiated the meeting between himself and Sue Gray. It wasn't at her request, it was at his.
Yeah, indeed, Adrian. And just as everything that Adam has highlighted, I mean, it's hard not to see what has happened as a stitch-up. We haven't had the Sue Gray report yet, and we don't know, how Johnson will react to that. I think it's very unlikely that he will resign, regardless of these photographs coming out and how bad they look. But, and I usually I'd hesitate to say that it looks like a stitch-up. As a journalist, as an editor, we're always, we don't want to speculate. We go on evidence and we look at the facts and what can be adduced from them. But as Adam's pointed out, in this sort of whole scandal, the evidence sort of strongly suggests that there has been sort of collusion between members of the Prime Minister's team, civil servants, probably unwillingly. Sue Gray, the pressure that's been applied to her, this meeting that you point out that Johnson wanted, and it has apparently tried to convince her not to publish a report at all. And then the third element being the media. The Daily Mail's front page this morning mentions nothing of this photograph that emerged of Johnson at Lee Kane's leaving party, toasting him with a drink. Many of the other front pages of the newspapers do carry that story. The Daily Mail hasn't. The Daily Mail has also been at the center of these briefings against Sue Gray, saying that, she has been enjoying the limelight a bit too much, casting doubt over her integrity, even though, weeks and weeks and months have been spent on ensuring us that she's absolutely the right person for the job. So it's in all these ways, the police, the number 10, and the media, how these elements have come together to get us to the point where, as Adam points out, that picture, which clearly shows Boris Johnson at a party with a drink, surrounded by party food and other people, he hasn't been fined for that. He wasn't even sent a questionnaire for that. The Metropolitan Police can't or won't explain why he wasn't fined, but junior members of staff were. And so all of this is just, the perception of it is that something is being stitched up. And that's the real worry, I think. The public are not stupid. They will see that.
Yeah, and Hardeep, the other main right-wing tabloid, The Sun, does have a picture of Johnson on its front page, but it isn't their lead story. And virtually every other newspaper, including the Daily Star, which these days goes out of its way to avoid politics when it can, has this as its lead story, including as well some right-wing broadsheets like the Times and the Telegraph. But significant, I think, that the Mail ignores the story on its front page. The Sun very much downplays it. And the Byline Times was born out of a concern about the connection between politicians, the press, and the police. And if anybody wants to explore that nexus, this is a great moment to do it, I would suggest.
Unfortunately, yes. It's just another case in point of all those elements coming together. And I think this, this real lawlessness, not just the perception of it, but the reality of it at the heart of the government. And, we have done a lot of work on Byline Times. And, even before the paper began, Peter Jukes, our co-founder, all the way through the phone hacking scandal to now this sort of vote leave government that we have, led by Johnson and Michael Gove. Of course, they were head of the Vote Leave campaign with Dominic Cummings, which was found guilty of breaking electoral rules. So right the way through, we've seen this sort of merger of journalism and, high-tier politics. And I think, what is playing out now is another example of that, and another example of why at Byline Times, we're very clear that the established media, the right-wing tabloids, have a huge amount of influence over our lives in this country, because they have a huge amount of influence over politicians. And they're a huge power block in their own right. And, if that's not scrutinized, then we're ending up in the situations that we're in.
Yeah, well, let us not forget that Leveson II, which was the planned inquiry into the connection between the police, the press and politicians, was scrapped by the then Conservative Prime Minister Theresa May. Many people believe because there was a trade-off in terms of those same newspapers supporting her at the time in her leadership, but she called off the attack dogs of Leveson II, which would have got into that really messy and very close relationship between certain press barons, the police, and the top politicians in this country. So it's just always worth, I think, flying a flag for Leveson II. And there's a previous episode of the podcast, if you want to go back and listen to that and find out all about Leveson II, why it was canned and what it might have discovered. Adam, as each day goes by, I mean, one ceases to be amazed at the Teflon ability of Boris Johnson, or the apparent Teflon ability of Boris Johnson, the sense that the public don't really care about these things, that these things won't stick to him. But it mustn't it? And people seeing photographs like the one that, in fairness, ITV, we should credit them, the photograph that ITV leaked from this party, the public, they're not stupid.
I think if you look at the polls, it clearly has stuck. Yes, the Prime Minister is still in the job, and he clearly has no shame. And there is, as Hardeep says, there's very little chance that he will resign, no matter what comes out. That is not the same as saying that he has survived and got away with it. If you look at the opinion polls, there has been a collapse in his approval ratings. There was a slight recovery to those at the start of the Ukraine war, but that has now faded away. And he's now deeply distrusted by the public, not only on the bare approval ratings, but also the Conservative Party polling. They've been consistently below Labour for some time now, and also in all the other measures of public support. Do you trust the government? Do you trust them on the economy? On a whole range of issues, they're far behind. So I do think it has had a big impact, but of course it hasn't had the impact where it needs to be, which is on Conservative MPs who ultimately, in the first instance, are able to make the decision on his future. And as things stand, the threshold that needs to be reached before they can have a vote on the leadership hasn't been reached. It could still happen, but it's been some time now, and I think some letters have been withdrawn, a few more have gone in. We're still stuck in no man's land on that, really.
Maybe they will think that he could ride out even the next week and the Sue Gray report. He hasn't been fined, in addition to the one fine he received. But I guess the question is, to what extent will the MPs realise that Johnson's toxicity will spread to the entire party and take them all down with him, potentially? It's really interesting that we're all being held hostage. And as Adam said, there is nothing in the system, and there is nothing that can, in this situation that we find ourselves in, where a Prime Minister has broken the law, lied to Parliament, and still remains in position. There's nothing. We are reliant on Conservative MPs around him. It's an extraordinary situation, really, and these aren't normal times.
Hardeep Matharu, and before that, Adam Bienkov. My name's Adrian Goldberg, and you've been listening to the Byline Times podcast. If you like what we do, please support our work. You can take out a subscription to our brilliant monthly newspaper, the Byline Times, by going to our website, where you'll find more details. That's at bylinetimes.com. And if you do take out a subscription, you're not only getting a great newspaper edited by Hardeep, you're supporting Byline TV, Byline Radio, and this podcast as well. And if you have already done so, thank you. I'll see you again soon. Cheers.